For decades, the world has romanticized Elvis and Priscilla as the ultimate rock and roll fairy tale, the king finding his queen. But strip away the Graceland glamour, and a much darker reality emerges. When they met, Elvis was a 24-year-old superstar, and Priscilla was just 14. Elvis didn't just date Priscilla, he systematically reprogrammed her. He isolated her at Graceland, changed her clothes, and dictated her behavior to build his obedient fantasy. This isn't a love story. It is a case study on grooming, total control, and the inevitable destruction of a woman's identity. To understand why Elvis needed a woman he could mold completely, we must look at the suffocating bond that defined his existence from day one. Elvis Aaron Presley was born on January 8, 1935, in a two-room shack in Tupelo, Mississippi. But he wasn't born alone. He came into this world minutes after his stillborn twin brother, Jesse Garon. This tragedy defined Elvis's existence before he even took his first breath. He grew up as the surviving half of a broken whole, carrying the weight of his mother's frantic grief. The death of Jesse was not something the family simply moved past. It was a ghost that lived in the corners of their small house. For Gladys, the loss of one son amplified her devotion to the survivor until it became an obsession. She believed that when one twin died, the surviving child inherited the strength and soul of the other. She looked at Elvis and saw two lives that needed protecting. This created a psychological pressure cooker for the young boy. He was not just living for himself, he was living to justify his own survival and to heal his mother's broken heart. From his earliest memories, he felt incomplete without her, a feeling rooted in the trauma of his birth, in the crushing poverty of his childhood, especially after his father Vernon was jailed for check fraud. Gladys became his universe. She didn't just love him, she clung to him with the desperation of a woman who had already lost one child. The family lost their home after Vernon's arrest, forcing Gladys and Elvis to move in with relatives. This period cemented the dynamic that would rule their lives. Vernon was unreliable, a man who had failed to provide, so Gladys stepped into the void. She worked long hours as a seamstress and a nurse's aide, scraping together pennies to keep them fed, but her eyes were always on her son. The outside world was cruel to the Presleys. They were viewed as the lowest rung of society in Tupelo, and Gladys was determined that the harshness of their reality would not touch her son. She walked him to school until he was a teenager. She forbade him from swimming in creeks, terrified he would drown. Every potential accident was a death sentence in her mind. Other children mocked him, calling him a mama's boy, but Elvis did not push her away. He absorbed her fear. Elvis was a lonely, shy boy who found solace in a cheap guitar, holding onto his mother's skirt because she was the only wall between him and a world that felt dangerous. This wasn't just mother and son, it was a shared soul, forged in trauma and survival. While other boys his age were learning independence and roughhousing in the streets, Elvis was inside, listening to the radio with Gladys. They developed a private language, a way of communicating that required few words. They spoke in baby talk long past the age it was appropriate, a sign of their refusal to let him grow up and leave her. When they moved to Memphis in search of a better life, the isolation only deepened. The city was big and loud, and they were still poor. They lived in boarding houses and public housing courts where privacy was non-existent. Yet within those cramped walls, they created their own sanctuary. They slept in the same bed until Elvis reached adolescence, a fact that speaks less of impropriety and more of a desperate, clinging poverty, where space was scarce and emotional separation was impossible. As Elvis grew older, the dynamic did not normalize, it intensified. He did not date like other teenagers. He brought girls home not to impress them, but to seek Gladys's approval. If she disapproved, the girl was gone. His ambition to succeed was not driven by a desire for fame, but by a promise to buy his mother a house where she would never have to work again. He wanted to lift her out of the misery that had defined their lives since the day Vernon was dragged away to prison. When success finally came, it was violent and sudden. Elvis was thrust onto the world stage, but every check he cashed, every car he bought was for her. He moved her into Graceland, surrounding her with velvet and maids, thinking he was saving her. Instead, he was isolating her further. The fame terrified Gladys. She saw the screaming crowds not as fans, but as a mob trying to take her boy away. She began to drink heavily to cope with the anxiety, her health deteriorating rapidly as Elvis spent more time on the road and on movie sets. On August 14, 1958, Elvis Presley's world crumbled. Gladys Presley, his mother and his only anchor, died of heart failure and hepatitis. She was only 46 years old. The news reached Elvis while he was serving in the Army, stationed in Texas. He rushed back to Memphis, but he was too late to save her. The scene at Graceland was not one of quiet mourning. It was a scene of total devastation. Witnesses described Elvis as behaving like a wounded animal. He refused to leave her body. He spoke to her, pleading with her to wake up, touching her cold feet and hands. Elvis didn't just mourn like a dutiful son. He screamed, smashed things, and wanted to jump into the grave. At the funeral, his wails were so loud they could be heard outside the church. He threw himself across the casket, sobbing that he had no reason to live. It took several men to physically pull him away so they could lower her into the ground. The relationship between Elvis and Gladys was unusual. It was an absolute symbiosis. They shared a language of nicknames and secret gestures. She was his shield from the outside world, the only one who loved him for being a poor Mississippi boy, not for being the king of rock and roll. Her death severed the only true connection he had to his own identity. Without her, he was surrounded by employees, sycophants, and fans, but he had no one who knew him as the twin of Jesse Guerin. He had lost his moral compass and his emotional safety net. He returned to the Army and later to Hollywood, a changed man. The grief did not fade, it calcified. He spent the rest of his life trying to fill the void she left, searching for that same unconditional love in women, in drugs, and in the adoration of strangers, but he never found it again. When she died, Elvis's defenses shattered. He fell into a state of extreme panic and loneliness. The pain of losing his mother left a dark void in Elvis's psyche. He longed for a woman who could fill that void, but he also harbored a morbid fear of betrayal and hurt. The mature women of Hollywood, the actresses like Natalie Wood or Anita Wood, were too shrewd, too independent. They had past, they had ambitions, and most importantly, they had the ability to leave him. Elvis didn't need a peer. He wasn't looking for a partner. He was looking for control, safety, and someone he could shape. Fate, or perhaps a cruel cosmic joke, led him to Germany. In 1959, Elvis Presley was stationed in Friedberg, West Germany. This was the king's period of exile. No stage, no lights, no cheers, only military discipline, the bone-chilling cold of Europe, and gnawing boredom. Elvis rented a house outside the barracks in Bad Nauheim to live with his father Vernon and grandmother Minnie May. The house became an isolated fortress where Elvis held all-night parties to escape the silence. He craved attention, but was also highly wary of those who approached him for fame. On September 13, 1959, Curry Grant, a friend from the military, brought a young woman to Elvis's house. Her name was Priscilla Beaulieu. Priscilla was born on May 24, 1945. When she walked through Elvis's door, she was only 14 years old. The daughter of an Air Force officer, She lived a nomadic life, constantly moving from place to place depending on her stepfather's job transfers. She was small and shy, dressed in a white-trimmed navy dress and white stockings. She was in ninth grade. Her world revolved around homework, the strict rules of her military family, and the innocent first stirrings of love. She knew nothing of manipulation, drugs, or the price of fame. She was the perfect prey Elvis was unconsciously searching for. When Priscilla entered the smoke-filled living room, 24-year-old Elvis Presley immediately took notice. The 10-year age difference at this stage was a chasm. A 24-year-old man who had experienced all the glory and bitterness of the heights of fame faced a 14-year-old girl who hadn't even graduated from high school. But Elvis didn't see a child. He saw potential. He saw those big, innocent eyes just like Gladys's eyes when she was young. He saw a fragility that needed protection. And most importantly, he saw an audience that was utterly pure. Elvis didn't push things into a physical relationship right away. He was too careful for that. He knew that moving too fast would snap the illusion. Instead, he wrapped himself in the role of protector, older brother, mentor, guardian, someone safe to trust. He tested boundaries in quieter ways. How late she would stay, how far she would bend the rules at home, how willing she was to keep secrets for him. Every time she slipped out to see him, the distance between her and her family's protection widened and his gravity strengthened. In that world, closeness became something he controlled. He framed restraint as virtue. I want to protect your innocence. And to a young girl, that sounded like nobility. In practice, it kept the power in his hands. He could set the pace, define what was right, and make her feel grateful for limits he chose. It also preserved the image he wanted, not a real partner with equal footing, but an ideal, carefully maintained, admired, and shaped. Meanwhile, his adult life continued on separate tracks, out of her view. Priscilla wasn't allowed to be fully human inside that orbit. She was curated into a role. He began molding her from the smallest things. He showed her how to dress, how to walk. He showed displeasure when she wore baggy dresses. "You have beautiful eyes," he said, "but you hide them behind those glasses and that pale makeup." Those were the first needles that injected the idea into her mind that she wasn't good enough, that she needed to change to be worthy of him. Priscilla, with the mentality of a child in love with an idol, swallowed each remark as truth. She began to change. She tried to be more mature, more seductive in the way Elvis described. She was erasing her own identity to become the ideal in his imagination. In March 1960, Elvis's military service ended. The day he left Germany to return to America was a chaotic scene. Thousands of fans, newspapers, flashing cameras. Amidst the crowd, Priscilla stood alone, small and frightened. Elvis promised to call, promised not to forget her. But when the plane took off, leaving Priscilla at Rhine-Main Airport, she felt as if all her oxygen had been sucked out. She was back to being an ordinary 14-year-old schoolgirl in a foreign country, while the man she loved was returning to his throne in Hollywood, where thousands of more beautiful, more mature women awaited him. This separation should have been the end of a fleeting age gap romance. Priscilla should have cried for a while, then forgotten, then grown up and found a suitable man. But Elvis wouldn't let her go. He didn't want to lose his unfinished work. He needed reassurance, a safe haven where he could return whenever his mind was in turmoil. Priscilla wasn't just a lover. She was his reserve tranquilizer. For the next 2 years, from 1960 to 1962, their relationship lasted through transatlantic telephone cables. Elvis made Priscilla his secret girlfriend. He called her at irregular hours, complaining about work pressures and the sycophants surrounding him. He lamented his loneliness even in the midst of the greatest fame. These calls were a noose tightening around the young woman's mind. Priscilla lived in a state of agonizing waiting. She didn't dare go out with friends, fearing she might miss his call. She didn't dare look at other men, feeling it would be a betrayal of the king. She lived like a nun in a convent of distant love, worshiping a God whose presence was only through his voice. Meanwhile, American newspapers were full of news about Elvis's affairs. He dated Juliet Prowse. He courted Nancy Sinatra. Priscilla read it all. She cut up those articles, weeping and agonizing. When she mustered the courage to ask Elvis over the phone, he cruelly dismissed her concerns or manipulated her with anger. It's just a publicity stunt for the movie. Don't you believe me? If you don't believe me, then we have nothing more to say. The constant threat of ending their relationship terrified Priscilla. She learned to swallow her tears, to accept that to be loved by Elvis, she had to accept sharing, to accept being invisible. That was the first lesson of her training to become a living doll, silence and acceptance. But patience over the phone wasn't enough for Elvis. He felt his remote control was waning. He needed her close, within sight, within reach. He needed her in Memphis. In 1962, Elvis began his campaign to convince Priscilla's parents once again. He invited her to America for summer and Christmas holidays. These short trips were tests. He let her experience the opulent life at Graceland, showing her luxury and power, but he also showed her dependence. At Graceland, she was nobody without him. She was completely lost among the Memphis Mafia bodyguards, rough men who treated women like toys. The summer of 1963 marked a decisive turning point. Elvis no longer wanted to send her back to Germany. He wanted to possess her completely. He called Captain Beaulieu, painting a picture of a wonderful education. He said Priscilla should move to Memphis to finish her high school education at a prestigious Catholic private school. He swore she wouldn't live with him at Graceland, but would live with his father, Vernon, and stepmother, Dee, in a nearby house. He promised to supervise her studies and protect her virginity until their marriage. It was a perfect plan, playing on her parents' desire for their daughter to receive the best possible education. Paul Beaulieu, though skeptical, was pressured by his daughter, who had cried, gone on a hunger strike, and threatened to ruin her life if she wasn't allowed to go, and by Elvis's mesmerizing persuasion, and nodded. It was a fateful nod. Priscilla Beaulieu, not yet 18, packed her bags and left her family, boarding a plane to Memphis. She thought she was flying to freedom, to true love. Unbeknownst to her, she was flying straight into a locked golden cage where the key lay in the pocket of a man losing control of reality. That flight didn't take her to heaven. It led her to the beginning of the most brutal process of self-annihilation. The promise Elvis made to Captain Beaulieu, that Priscilla would live under the supervision of his father Vernon and stepmother Dee in a separate house, lasted exactly 2 weeks. It was a lie designed to placate a concerned father and satisfy the optics of propriety. The moment the dust settled, the pretense was dropped. Elvis did not import Priscilla across the Atlantic Ocean to have her live down the street. He brought her there to be in his house, in his world, and eventually in his bed. Under the cover of darkness, she was moved from the separate residence into Graceland. The staff was instructed to keep it quiet. The Memphis Mafia, Elvis's entourage of bodyguards and yes-men, was told she was now a permanent fixture. Priscilla Beaulieu, a 17-year-old high school student, was effectively cohabiting with the most famous man on the planet, hidden behind the stone walls of a mansion that would soon become her fortress and her prison. The Graceland that Priscilla entered in 1963 was not the museum of hushed reverence that tourists visit today. It was a frat house run on limitless money and testosterone. It was a nocturnal kingdom ruled by a monarch who feared the silence of the day. The windows were covered with aluminum foil to block out the sun. The air conditioning was cranked down to freezing temperatures, regardless of the season. The clocks were irrelevant. Time was measured only by Elvis's whims. If he was awake, it was day. If he slept, the house held its breath. Into this chaotic, hyper-masculine environment walked a teenage girl who still had to worry about algebra homework and school uniforms. The clash between these two realities was not just disorienting, it was psychologically shattering. Elvis did not adjust his life to accommodate Priscilla's schedule. He expected her to bend her biological rhythms to match his. He lived essentially as a vampire, waking up in the late afternoon, watching movies, or hanging out all night, and going to bed well after dawn. Priscilla, enrolled at the Immaculate Conception High School, had to be in class by 8 a.m. A normal human body cannot sustain this dichotomy. She was trying to live the life of a dutiful student by day and the consort of a rock star by night. She was exhausted. She was falling asleep in class. She was drifting through the hallways like a ghost, her mind foggy from sleep deprivation, terrifyingly aware that if she fell asleep early at Graceland, she would miss the precious hours with Elvis, or worse, he would find someone else to entertain him. Elvis saw her fatigue. He offered no compromise. She was expected to adjust to him, not the other way around. He offered a solution that was standard practice in his world, a solution that would tighten the leash of control around her neck. He introduced her to his medicine cabinet. Elvis handed a teenage girl a handful of white pills. They were dexedrine, potent amphetamines used to keep soldiers awake in combat and truck drivers alert on long hauls. He told her they were just to help her stay up, to give her energy. He normalized it. In his world, chemistry was just a tool to regulate the body. Priscilla took them. The effect was immediate. The exhaustion vanished, replaced by a jittery, artificial buzz. Her heart raced, her eyes widened, and suddenly she could stay up until 4 a.m. listening to Elvis's monologues without yawning. She could function. But what goes up must come down. When the manic energy of the amphetamines wore off, or when Elvis finally decided it was time to sleep, she was left vibrating with chemical anxiety. She couldn't sleep, so Elvis offered the counterbalance. Red pills, Placidol, heavy sedatives that would knock her out like a light switch. This became her cycle. White pill to wake up for school. White pill to stay up for Elvis. Red pill to pass out. This was not recreational drug use. This was functional addiction imposed by a 30-year-old man on a minor to ensure she remained available to him at all times. By controlling her sleep, he controlled her consciousness. She became chemically dependent on him, not just for love and shelter, but for the basic ability to function. The pills blurred the edges of her reality, making the abnormal seem normal, making the isolation seem bearable. It dulled her critical thinking skills just enough to stop her from questioning why a high school senior was living in a perpetual narcotic haze to please a boyfriend. With her mind chemically regulated, Elvis finalized the physical transformation. The makeover that began in Germany was now pushed to the extreme. The jet black hair was teased into a massive, towering beehive, a helmet of hair that discouraged touch. The makeup became a mask, heavy winged eyeliner and false lashes, applied before he even woke up. She was no longer allowed to be natural. She was strictly a visual product, required to be camera-ready 24/7. He insisted on false eyelashes, not just for events, but for everyday life inside the house. He wanted her to look like a porcelain doll. He famously told her, "I want to see the result, not the process." This sentence is the key to understanding their entire relationship. Elvis did not want a human being with flaws, pores, and morning breath. He wanted an illusion. He forbade her from letting him see her applying the makeup or fixing her hair. She had to wake up before him, rush to the bathroom, apply her face, and return to bed so that when he opened his eyes, he saw perfection. She was never allowed to be vulnerable. She was never allowed to be just Priscilla. She was always the girlfriend, a role she had to perform 24 hours a day. The transformation wasn't just chemical, it was aesthetic. Elvis dismissed her modest German wardrobe as uninspiring, replacing it with high collars, rhinestones, and clingy fabrics purchased in Las Vegas. He didn't ask her what she liked, he simply pointed and paid. He wasn't dressing a partner, he was costume designing a Vegas showgirl to play the role of a conservative wife. Priscilla, dazzled by the price tags and the attention, initially mistook this control for generosity. She thought he was spoiling her. She didn't realize he was erasing her taste and replacing it with his own. Every time she put on a dress he chose, she was wearing his identity. Within a year of arriving in Memphis, Priscilla Beaulieu had physically ceased to exist. In her place stood a miniature feminine version of Elvis Presley. The transformation was total. She walked like him, she talked like him, she dressed to complement him. But the molding process wasn't just skin deep. Elvis needed to sculpt her behavior. He needed a companion who was submissive, devoid of opinions that conflicted with his own, and entirely centered on his ego. He began to curate her mind. He dictated what she read. He gave her books on spirituality, on religion, on the esoteric subjects he was obsessed with. He wanted her to be on his wavelength, but only as a sounding board. He didn't want debate, he wanted validation. If she voiced an opinion that contradicted him, especially in front of the boys, the atmosphere in the room would drop to absolute zero. Elvis would get cold or he would snap. "You don't know what you're talking about," he would say. Or worse, he would give her the silent treatment. For a girl whose entire world had narrowed down to one person, his silence was a death sentence. She learned quickly. She learned to read the room. She learned that her job was to nod, to smile, to agree, and to soothe. She learned that her intelligence was a liability unless it was used to flatter him. The isolation at Graceland was the kiln in which this new personality was fired. Priscilla had no friends her own age. Her classmates at Immaculate Conception viewed her as an alien species. She was the girl living with Elvis. She was untouchable. She couldn't invite them over for sleepovers. She couldn't go to the malt shop after school. She went from the classroom straight to the waiting limousine, back to the gates of Graceland. Her social circle consisted entirely of the wives and girlfriends of the Memphis Mafia, but even these relationships were fraught with danger. The Memphis Mafia was a snake pit of gossip and jockeying for favor. If Priscilla confided in one of the wives, that wife might tell her husband, who would tell Elvis, to gain leverage. Trust was non-existent. She was surrounded by people, yet completely alone. Elvis exploited this isolation. He played on her insecurity. He would constantly critique other women on television or in magazines in front of her. "She's too fat," he would say. "Her neck is too long. She has no class." These weren't just idle comments, they were warnings. He was outlining the boundaries of his desire. He was telling Priscilla exactly what would happen if she let herself go, if she gained 5 pounds, if she cut her hair. She lived in a state of perpetual body dysmorphia, constantly scanning herself for flaws that might cause his gaze to wander. The fear of being replaced was the whip he used to keep her in line, and there were plenty of potential replacements. While Priscilla sat in Graceland, waiting for him to wake up or return from a movie set, Elvis was living the life of a bachelor god. He was filming movies in Hollywood, surrounded by the most beautiful women in the world. And Margaret, his co-star in Viva Las Vegas, was everything Priscilla was not: independent, fiery, talented, and a star in her own right. The rumors of their affair were not just rumors, they were front-page news. Priscilla read the papers, she saw the photos. The pain was visceral. When she dared to confront Elvis, to scream, to throw a vase, a rare moment of the old Priscilla breaking through, he shut her down with gaslighting of the highest order. He told her she was crazy. He told her she was paranoid. He told her the press was lying. If you're going to be jealous, he threatened, you can go back to Germany right now. The threat of exile was his ultimate weapon. He knew she had nowhere to go. She had dropped out of her previous life. She had no career, no money of her own, no support system in America other than him. She was trapped. So she swallowed the humiliation. She apologized for being jealous of his infidelity. She learned to suppress her gut instincts and accept his version of reality. This is the hallmark of deep psychological abuse. The victim ends up comforting the abuser for the pain the abuser caused. By the time Priscilla graduated from high school in 1965, the grooming was complete. She was no longer the girl who had arrived with a suitcase and a head full of dreams. She was a woman who walked on eggshells. She was a beautiful, hollowed-out vessel, filled with Elvis's desires, Elvis's fears, and Elvis's pills. She had been trained to be the perfect consort. She knew when to speak and when to shut up. She knew how to look perfect at 4 a.m. She knew that her purpose on this earth was to be the soft place for the king to land. But the molding process had a flaw. Elvis had created a woman who was entirely focused on him, yes, but in doing so, he had also created a woman who was beginning to feel the walls of the cage pressing in on her ribs. He had made her grow up too fast. He had exposed her to the dark underbelly of adult desire and manipulation before she was 20. And somewhere, deep beneath the layers of hairspray and amphetamines, the embers of resentment were starting to glow. He had built a doll, but he had forgotten that even dolls, if you squeeze them too hard, will eventually break. The tragedy was set in motion. The wedding was approaching, not as a celebration of love, but as a mandatory clause in a contract written by managers and public opinion. The doll was ready for the display case, but the man who put her there was already starting to look for a new toy. By 1966, the secret of Graceland was becoming a liability. The counterculture was exploding outside the gates. The Beatles were rewriting the rules of fame. Vietnam was heating up, and the sexual revolution was dismantling the old moral order. But Elvis Presley was stuck in a time capsule. He was still peddling a sanitized 1950s image of Southern politeness and family values. The presence of a live-in teenage girlfriend, hidden like a dirty secret upstairs, threatened to shatter that carefully curated brand. The morals clause in his movie contracts was a ticking bomb. The whispers in Hollywood were getting louder. The press was circling. Colonel Tom Parker, the cigar-chomping architect of Elvis's career, decided the risk was no longer calculable. He didn't care about Elvis's happiness. He cared about the revenue stream. Just before Christmas 1966, Parker made the situation clear to Elvis. The grooming phase was over. It was time to legitimize the asset. He issued an ultimatum that was essentially a business order. Marry the girl or risk losing the fan base. The era of the Bachelor King was ending not by choice, but by corporate decree. Elvis, who had spent years dodging commitment, keeping Priscilla in a state of suspended animation, suddenly found himself cornered. He had no room left to maneuver. The engagement that followed wasn't a romantic crescendo. It was a surrender to public relations. Elvis proposed with a 3.5-carat diamond ring. It was expensive, flashy, and cold. He presented it to Priscilla not with tears of joy, but with the resigned air of a man fulfilling an obligation. For Priscilla, who had spent 4 years enduring the humiliation of being the hidden mistress, the ring was a vindication. It was the trophy she had suffered for. She believed it signified love. In reality, it signified ownership. She was being promoted from a leased vehicle to a purchased asset. The wedding date was set for May 1st, 1967. The operation was planned with the secrecy and precision of a military strike. The wedding at the Aladdin Hotel in Las Vegas lasted exactly 8 minutes. It was not a ceremony. It was a press conference with vows. There were few friends, mostly business associates and members of the Memphis Mafia. Elvis stood in his black brocade silk tuxedo, sweating under the hot lights, reciting lines he had memorized. Priscilla stood beside him, encased in the white chiffon dress she had helped design, her face painted to his specifications, her hair towering in the mandated beehive. They cut the 6-tiered cake not as husband and wife, but as co-stars in a production directed by the Colonel. The photos flashed around the world. The narrative was secured. The living in sin rumor was dead. Elvis was a respectable family man, but the ink on the marriage license hadn't even dried before the dynamic inside Graceland shifted from control to neglect. For Elvis, the chase was over. He had captured the butterfly, pinned it to the board, and put it behind glass. Now that she was legally his, the urgency to impress her vanished. The mystique he so valued, the tension of the forbidden, evaporated the moment the law sanctioned their bed. Priscilla, now 21, expected marriage to bring intimacy. Instead, it brought a strange, suffocating normalcy. She was Mrs. Presley now. She had the title, the credit cards, and the staff, but she was still subject to the same draconian rules. She still couldn't have a career. She still couldn't voice an opinion that contradicted his. And now she had a new pressure to breed. In the traditional Southern mindset that Elvis clung to, a wife's primary function was reproduction. It happened almost immediately. Priscilla discovered she was pregnant just weeks after the wedding. For a young bride in love, this should have been joyous news. For Priscilla, it was a source of terror. She knew Elvis. She knew his obsession with physical perfection. She knew his childish need to be the center of attention. A baby threatened both. When she told him, Elvis didn't celebrate. He went quiet. He retreated into himself. He worried about how fatherhood would affect his sex symbol status. He worried about the noise, but most of all, he worried about Priscilla's body. The pregnancy triggered the deepest, most pathological wire in Elvis's psychology, the Madonna whore complex. This was the fracture point that would ultimately destroy their marriage before it had even truly begun. Elvis idolized mothers. He worshipped the memory of Gladys. To him, a mother was a saintly, asexual figure, a provider of comfort, not an object of desire. Conversely, he could only feel sexual desire for women he viewed as tainted, loose, or transient. As Priscilla's belly swelled, she transitioned in Elvis's mind from the whore category to the Madonna category. The sexual switch in his brain flipped to off. He stopped touching her. He couldn't reconcile the image of his pregnant wife with the erotic fantasy he had constructed. He pulled away physically, leaving Priscilla feeling undesirable and gross. She tried to maintain the illusion, dressing carefully, keeping her makeup on, but she couldn't hide the biology. She was becoming a mother, and in doing so, she was losing her husband. During her pregnancy, Elvis grew restless. He asked for a trial separation. He claimed he needed space to think, to focus on his career. It was a cruel abandonment at her most vulnerable moment. While she sat in Memphis watching her body change, Elvis was in Hollywood or Las Vegas, surrounding himself with the boys and, inevitably, other women. He needed validation that he was still the desirable, dangerous Elvis, not the domestic dad-to-be. Priscilla knew this. The old pattern of denial and acceptance reasserted itself. She focused on preparing the nursery, distracting herself with the trappings of motherhood to ignore the silence in the master bedroom. On February 1st, 1968, exactly 9 months after the wedding, Lisa Marie Presley was born. Elvis was present. He was emotional. He held his daughter and cried. For a brief moment, the shared wonder of new life brought them together, but it was a mirage. The birth of Lisa Marie didn't fix the marriage. It cemented the asexual dynamic. Priscilla was now Satinin, his pet name for his mother. She was mom. She was holy. Intimacy evaporated. According to Priscilla, Elvis struggled to desire a woman who had become a mother. This became the brutal, unspoken truth of the Presley marriage. From the moment Lisa Marie was born, their physical relationship effectively withered away. Priscilla was 22 years old, a woman in her prime, beautiful, healthy, and legally married to the sex symbol of the century. And she was living in a celibate marriage. Elvis still loved her in his own warped way. He showered her with gifts. He bought her cars, jewelry, furs. He treated her like a precious artifact. But he wouldn't touch her. He couldn't. The psychological block was absolute. He told her he needed to travel to find himself. He told her he had to focus on his reading. He made excuses, but the truth was in his eyes. When he looked at her, he saw Gladys. And you don't sleep with your mother. Priscilla's life in the late 60s became a gilded purgatory. Graceland was a bustling headquarters for Elvis's career, but for her, it was a mausoleum of boredom. She had a staff to cook, a staff to clean, a nanny to watch the baby. She had no purpose. Elvis didn't want her working. He didn't want her having hobbies that took her away from the house. She was expected to be there, looking perfect, waiting for him to return from his tours or his movie sets. She tried to fill the void. She took dance lessons until Elvis complained it made her legs too muscular. She tried to get into fashion until Elvis lost interest. She was a bird in a cage, pecking at the mirror. She began to realize that the perfect life she had been groomed for was a sham. She had the man, but she didn't have him. She had the house, but it wasn't a home. It was a hotel where she was the permanent guest. Meanwhile, Elvis was undergoing his own crisis. His movie career had become a joke. He was churning out terrible formulaic musical comedies that embarrassed him. The music scene had passed him by. He was a relic. In 1968, desperate to reclaim his throne, he filmed the '68 comeback special. It was a triumph. Clad in black leather, sweating raw, Elvis reminded the world why he was king. He was dangerous again. He was vibrant. But he didn't bring that energy home. He poured it all into the audience. He fed on the adoration of the crowd because it was safer than real intimacy. The crowd didn't ask for conversation. The crowd didn't need him to be a father or a husband. The crowd just wanted the image. And Elvis was unparalleled at giving the image. As the 60s bled into the 70s, the distance between the couple widened into a chasm. Elvis returned to performing live in Las Vegas. This was the beginning of the jumpsuit era. He was spending weeks at the International Hotel. Priscilla would visit, bringing Lisa Marie, playing the role of the dutiful wife in the booth. But she saw the decay. She saw the pills increasing. The medication that had started as a way to regulate sleep was now a full-blown addiction. Elvis was taking uppers to perform, downers to sleep, painkillers for mysterious aches. His moods were volatile. He could be charming 1 minute and a tyrant the next. He shot out television sets. He threw food. He surrounded himself with sycophants who laughed at his jokes and catered to his every whim. Priscilla was the only one who dared to challenge him, and for that, she was pushed further away. She saw the man behind the sunglasses, the bloated, frightened man who was terrified of aging and irrelevance. She tried to help him. She tried to curb the pill intake, but Elvis didn't want help. He wanted enabling. He began to resent her for being a witness to his decline. It was easier to be with the guys, or with disposable women who didn't know him, who only saw the legend. By 1971, Priscilla was 26 years old. She had spent 12 years, nearly half her life, in Elvis's orbit. She had been his doll, his student, his wife, and the mother of his child. But she had never been herself. She looked in the mirror and saw the black hair and the heavy makeup, and she realized she didn't know the person underneath. She was wearing a mask that was fused to her skin. The resentment that had been simmering since the Germany days began to boil. She was tired of the lonely nights. She was tired of the gaslighting. She was tired of the celibacy. She was a woman with needs, emotional, intellectual, and physical, and she was starving in a banquet hall. The perfect marriage was a lie she was exhausted from telling. It was in this vacuum of neglect that the rebellion finally took root. It wasn't a sudden explosion. It was a slow awakening. Priscilla began to step out of the shadow. She started taking karate lessons. It seemed harmless enough. Elvis himself suggested it, obsessed as he was with martial arts. He introduced her to Mike Stone, a world-class instructor. He didn't realize he was handing his wife the key to her own cage. Mike Stone was the antithesis of the late-stage Elvis. He was fit, disciplined, grounded, and present. He didn't treat Priscilla like a fragile ornament. He treated her like a student with agency. In the dojo, Priscilla wasn't Mrs. Presley. She was a woman learning to use her body for strength, not just for display. For the first time, she felt power. She felt the ground under her feet. The affair that followed was inevitable. It was the desperate gasp of a drowning woman reaching for air. When Priscilla slept with Mike Stone, it wasn't just adultery. It was an act of reclamation. She was taking back the body that Elvis had claimed, dyed, dressed, and then discarded. She was shattering the Madonna pedestal Elvis had placed her on. She was proving to herself that she was alive, that she was desirable, and that she existed outside of the Presley mythology. But breaking away from a cult of personality is dangerous. Elvis was not just a husband. He was an industry, a deity to millions, and a man surrounded by armed guards who obeyed his every command. Priscilla knew that leaving him wouldn't just be a divorce, it would be an act of treason. She was terrified, but the fear of staying, of withering away in the golden cage, popping pills to sleep and waking up to an empty bed, finally outweighed the fear of leaving. The confrontation was coming. The doll was about to speak, and the words she would say would bring the walls of Graceland crashing down on the king's head. This betrayal was not something she could keep hidden in the shadows for long. In the claustrophobic ecosystem of the Presley world, secrets were currency, and everyone was bankrupt. The bodyguards knew. The maids knew. It was only a matter of time before the king knew. But Priscilla didn't wait for discovery. Emboldened by her new physical confidence and the realization that a life existed outside the darkened windows of Graceland, she chose to confront the inevitable. She was no longer asking for permission to live, she was serving notice. In 1972, inside a Las Vegas hotel suite, the confrontation finally occurred. It was not the melodramatic screaming match of a soap opera. It was a cold, devastating statement of fact. Priscilla told Elvis she was leaving. She didn't say she was leaving for Mike Stone. She said she was leaving for herself. She told him that she needed to find out what the world was like when she wasn't Mrs. Elvis Presley. Elvis's reaction was paralyzed shock. His psychological framework had no contingency plan for this. In his mind, He was the sun. Planets did not leave orbit. He had groomed her, molded her, and given her a life of unimaginable luxury. The concept of rejection was foreign to him. He first tried to dismiss it as a phase, a bout of female hysteria that would pass with a new car or a fur coat. When the gifts failed, he switched to intimidation. He reminded her who held the power and how little she had without him. But the old tricks didn't work. The fear that had kept her compliant for a decade had evaporated, replaced by a steely resolve. Seeing his control slipping, Elvis's behavior turned volatile and dangerous. According to Priscilla's later accounts, the final days of the marriage were marked by a terrifying act of possession. In a hotel room, desperate to reassert his dominance over the property that was walking away, Elvis forced himself on her. It was a violent physical assertion of conjugal rights, a final attempt to brand her body as his territory. It wasn't love. It was a frantic attempt to grab the leash of a running dog. When Priscilla walked out the door, moving into a 2-bedroom apartment near the ocean in Los Angeles, the reality hit Elvis with the force of a physical blow. The king was alone. The dollhouse was empty. His reaction was not grief. It was a murderous rage. Elvis's narcissism could not process the fact that his wife had chosen a karate instructor over the most famous man on earth. He fixated on Mike Stone. Stone became the vessel for all of Elvis's inadequacy and anger. In the drug-fueled hazes of late 1972 and early 1973, Elvis began to plot. He didn't just want to beat Stone up, he wanted him erased. This is the darkest chapter of the Elvis psyche, often glossed over in biographies. Elvis summoned Red West and Sonny West, his most loyal enforcers. He was manic, pacing the room, waving a gun. He ordered a hit. "Find him and kill him," he commanded. He discussed logistics. He wanted it to look like a robbery or a random accident. He was willing to pay. This wasn't a fleeting thought. It was a directive from the boss. The Memphis Mafia, usually willing to indulge his every whim, was terrified. They saw a man unhinged. They stalled. They told him they were looking into it. They were finding a contract killer, buying time until the drugs wore off, and the mood swung back to depression. Eventually, they talked him down, convincing him that the FBI would trace it back to him and destroy his career. The hit was called off, but the intent remained a stain on his legacy. The boy who loved his mother had become a man capable of ordering an execution because his ego was bruised. While Elvis raged, the legal machinery of divorce began to grind. This was the moment where the vultures circled. Vernon Presley, terrified of the financial fallout, viewed Priscilla as an enemy combatant. He had always been suspicious of outsiders, and now his worst fears were confirmed. He pressured Elvis to give her nothing. "She doesn't deserve a dime," was the prevailing sentiment in the Presley camp. They wanted to punish her for her disloyalty. Colonel Tom Parker saw a different threat. A messy public divorce trial was his nightmare. If Priscilla's lawyers subpoenaed Elvis's financial records to determine a settlement, they would inevitably uncover Parker's mismanagement. They would see the gambler's debts, the exorbitant commissions, the millions of dollars hemorrhaging from the estate. Parker needed a quick, quiet settlement. He didn't care about fairness. He cared about silence. Priscilla held the cards, though she likely didn't realize the full extent of her leverage. Under California law, she could have fought for half of everything earned during the marriage. She could have claimed ownership of master recordings, publishing rights, and future royalties. She could have exposed the drug use, the adultery, and the bizarre lifestyle at Graceland in open court. It would have destroyed Elvis's reputation and bankrupted the estate, but she didn't. Whether out of lingering love, fear of the machine, or a simple desire for peace, She chose the path of least resistance. On October 9, 1973, the divorce was finalized at the Santa Monica Superior Court. The settlement was shockingly modest for a star of Elvis's magnitude: a $725,000 cash payment, spousal support of $6,000 a month, child support of $4,000 a month, and half the proceeds from the sale of their Los Angeles home. The scene outside the courthouse was surreal. After signing the papers that dissolved their union, Elvis and Priscilla walked out hand in hand. They kissed for the cameras. Elvis was wearing a high-collared suit and oversized sunglasses. Priscilla looked chic and liberated. To the public, it looked like an amicable split between two people who had simply grown apart. In reality, it was a ceasefire. Priscilla had bought her freedom at a discount. Elvis had kept his secrets buried. With the divorce signed, the final guardrail on Elvis's life was removed. Priscilla had been the last person who remembered him as a human being, not just an icon. She was the last link to his youth, to the era before the jumpsuits and the Las Vegas residencies. Without her, and without the structure of a family life to maintain, Elvis surrendered completely to his vices. The years from 1973 to 1977 were a slow-motion suicide. Elvis surrounded himself with enablers. Dr. Nick became the most important person in his entourage, the man with the prescription pad who could cure any pain, real or imagined. The drug intake escalated from functional to lethal. Elvis was taking thousands of pills a year: painkillers, sedatives, stimulants, laxatives. His body began to rebel. He bloated, his face puffed up. He developed glaucoma, hypertension, and an enlarged colon. He tried to fill the Priscilla-shaped hole with other women. Linda Thompson, a beauty queen, moved into Graceland. She was kind, nurturing, and tolerant. She took on the role of caregiver, literally saving him from overdoses on multiple occasions, pulling pills out of his throat as he choked. But she wasn't Priscilla. She was a fan who became a nurse. Then came Ginger Alden, a young woman 20 years his junior. Elvis tried to recreate the grooming process with her, trying to mold her, buying her clothes, forcing a ring on her finger. But the magic was gone. He didn't have the energy to dominate anymore. He was a tired emperor barking orders at an empty room. Priscilla, meanwhile, was navigating the terrifying landscape of freedom. She was 28 years old, a single mother, and famous for being a wife. She had no resume, no job skills, and no real safety net. The world watched her with skepticism. Was she just a gold digger? Was she a vacuous doll who would collapse without the king's support? She opened a clothing boutique in Los Angeles called Bis and Beau. It was a small step, but a crucial one. It was her own. She waited on customers. She swept the floors. She learned about profit margins and inventory. For the first time in her life, she was making decisions that didn't require approval. She began to explore acting, a dream Elvis had crushed years earlier. She took classes, she auditioned. She was terrible at first, stiff and self-conscious, the residue of years of being told to sit still and look pretty. But she persisted. She was deprogramming herself, peeling away the layers of the Graceland persona to find the woman underneath. Despite the divorce, the cord between Elvis and Priscilla was never truly cut. They remained in contact. Elvis would call her late at night, rambling, incoherent, lonely. He would complain about his health, about the colonel, about the women who didn't understand him. Priscilla would listen. She became his confessor, his distant anchor. She watched from afar as he deteriorated, helpless to stop it. She saw the photos of him on stage, sweating, struggling to breathe, forgetting lyrics. She saw the headlines about his hospitalizations. She knew he was dying. She begged him to get help. She begged him to fire the colonel, to stop touring, to detox. But Elvis was trapped in the prison of his own construction. He had to tour to pay for the lifestyle, to pay the colonel's gambling debts, to support the dozens of leeches on his payroll. He was a cash cow being milked to death. He told her, "I'm caught in a trap. I can't walk out." The lyrics of his hit song, Suspicious Minds, had become his reality. The end came on August 16, 1977. Priscilla received the call in Los Angeles. It was Joe Esposito, Elvis's road manager. "Scylla, he's gone." The words were impossible. Elvis was immortal. He was a force of nature, but the biology of a human being has limits. His heart, strained by obesity and toxicity, had finally stopped. Priscilla flew to Memphis immediately. Graceland was a scene of Gothic hysteria. Thousands of weeping fans surrounded the gates. Inside, the family was in shock. Vernon Presley was inconsolable. But amidst the grief, the machinery of the estate was already grinding. The king was dead, and the scavenging was about to begin. Priscilla walked into the house she had escaped 4 years earlier. It smelled the same, old air conditioning and dust. She went upstairs to the bedroom she had shared with him. She saw his body. The man in the coffin was a caricature of the boy she had met in Germany. He was swollen, gray, defeated, but Priscilla didn't have the luxury of collapsing. She looked at Lisa Marie, 9 years old, now the heir to a kingdom that was crumbling. She looked at Vernon, who was too sick and too simple to handle the sharks circling the water. She realized that her role in Elvis's life hadn't ended with the divorce. In fact, the most important part was just beginning. She had been his doll. Now she had to become his guardian. The financial situation she uncovered was catastrophic. Elvis Presley, the biggest star in the world, had died cash poor. The estate was worth nominally a few $1,000,000, but the cash flow was practically non-existent, and the operating costs of Graceland were astronomical. The IRS was knocking on the door, demanding millions in inheritance taxes. The colonel was claiming he was owed huge sums. The bankers were advising Vernon to sell everything. "Sell Graceland," they said. "Sell the artifacts, liquidate, put the money in a trust for Lisa." It was the logical, prudent financial decision. It would have wiped the slate clean. Graceland would have been sold to a developer, likely bulldozed or turned into a tacky museum run by strangers. The jumpsuits would have been auctioned off to private collectors. The name Elvis would have slowly faded into a historical footnote, a cautionary tale of excess. Priscilla Presley said no. This was the moment the doll proved she was made of steel. She saw something the bankers didn't. She saw the people at the gates. She saw the thousands of fans who stood in the Memphis heat for days just to touch the brick wall of the mansion. She realized that Elvis wasn't just a musician. He was a religion. And Graceland was the Vatican. You don't sell the Vatican. You charge admission. She stepped into the power vacuum left by Elvis's death. She became the co-executor of the estate after Vernon died in 1979. She fired the sycophants. She hired serious business managers. She confronted the colonel. The legal battle with Tom Parker was a masterclass in vengeance. The investigation Priscilla launched revealed that Parker had no legal standing. He wasn't even a U.S. citizen. He was an illegal Dutch immigrant named Andreas Cornelis van Kuyk. He had been defrauding Elvis for decades. Priscilla's lawyers cornered him. They forced a settlement that stripped him of his future claims on the estate and severed his control over the Presley image. The parasite was finally removed. In 1982, Priscilla did the unthinkable. She opened the doors of Graceland to the public. Critics mocked her. They called it tacky. They said no one would pay to see the house of a drug addict. But on opening day, the line stretched for miles. They came in droves. They paid to walk on the shag carpet. They paid to see the jungle room. They paid to stand at the grave in the meditation garden. Graceland became a gold mine. Under Priscilla's stewardship, Elvis Presley Enterprises grew into a global conglomerate worth hundreds of millions of dollars. She licensed the image, the music, the merchandise. She protected the brand with the ferocity of a lioness. She ensured that Lisa Marie would inherit an empire, not a debt. But there is a tragic irony in Priscilla's victory. To save Elvis, she had to commodify him. She had to turn the man she loved into a product. She had to curate the myth, polishing the image of the king while burying the reality of the abuser, the addict, the broken man. She became the keeper of the flame, the high priestess of a cult she had once escaped. She rebuilt her own life, yes. She became a successful actress in the Naked Gun movies and the soap opera Dallas. She had other relationships, other children, but she could never truly escape the shadow. To the world, she was never just Priscilla, she was Elvis's widow. Every interview she gave, every red carpet she walked, the question was always the same. Tell us about Elvis. She had walked out of the cage, only to realize that the cage was the world itself. In the final analysis, the story of Elvis and Priscilla is a tragedy of consumption. Elvis consumed Priscilla's youth to feed his ego. Priscilla, in turn, consumed Elvis's legacy to ensure her survival. They used each other. Today, if you visit Graceland, you see the polished version of history. You see the gold records, the jumpsuits, the wedding photos. You see the fairy tale. But if you stand in the bedroom, the one room Priscilla keeps off limits to the public, you can almost feel the ghost. You can feel the stifling air of a room where the windows were never opened. You can hear the silence of a teenage girl waiting for the phone to ring. You can smell the hairspray and the stale smoke. Priscilla Presley survived the autopsy. She stitched herself back together, but the scars are there, hidden under the designer clothes, and the calm, practiced smile of a woman who learned long ago that survival depends on how well you play the part. She was the perfect doll, and in the end, she became the perfect CEO. It was the only way to make sure the game didn't end when the king stopped playing. The resurrection of the Presley estate was a business triumph, but it came with a personal cost that no accountant could quantify. By saving Graceland, Priscilla inadvertently cemented her own imprisonment. She had escaped the physical walls of the mansion in 1973, only to spend the rest of her life acting as its curator, tour guide, and gatekeeper. The Living Doll project initiated by Elvis didn't end with his death. It simply entered a new phase of perpetual maintenance. Priscilla was no longer performing for an audience of one. She was performing for an audience of millions, maintaining the fiction of the widow long after the marriage had dissolved. This role suffocated her attempts at a private life. Any man who entered her orbit found himself in a crowded room, sharing the bed with the ghost of the king, Marco Garibaldi, the man Priscilla spent over 20 years with after Elvis eventually left. He lived for 2 decades as Mr. Priscilla Presley, a footnote in a biography that had already been written. The shadow of Elvis was too long, too dark, and too profitable to ever step out of. Priscilla remained the primary vessel of the Presley mythology. She had to be the dignified face of the brand, constantly juxtaposed against the messy, drug-fueled reality of the man she had buried. But the true victim of this carefully curated existence was not Priscilla. It was Lisa Marie. If Priscilla was the doll, Lisa Marie was the prop that became sentient. Growing up as the only child of a deity, and his creation is a psychological experiment with no control group, Lisa Marie didn't have a childhood. She had a front row seat to a circus. As a child, she had watched her father descend into madness. She had seen him shoot televisions. She had seen him stumble. She had been spoiled rotten, given ponies and private jets to compensate for the absence of stability. Then she was handed over to her mother, the disciplinarian. Priscilla, terrified that Lisa Marie would inherit Elvis's self-destructive genes, pivoted to extreme control. She became the strict parent, the enforcer. This created a volatile dynamic. Lisa Marie rebelled. She didn't want to be a doll. She didn't want to be perfect. She wanted to burn it all down. She smoked, she drank, she experimented with drugs. She was screaming for attention in a world that only looked at her last name. The parallels between father and daughter were terrifying. Lisa Marie possessed Elvis's charisma, his sneer, and his addictive personality. Priscilla watched in horror as history began to repeat itself. She tried to intervene, using the tools she knew: structure, Scientology, rehab. But you cannot manage addiction like a business portfolio. Lisa Marie's life became a series of chaotic marriages to Michael Jackson, to Nicolas Cage, that mirrored her father's need for spectacle and dysfunction. She was searching for a savior, just as Elvis had searched for a mother. She found only enablers and fellow broken souls. The tragedy of the Presleys is that the money never protected them. It only funded their destruction. The estate that Priscilla built ensured that Lisa Marie never had to work, never had to face consequences, and never had to develop the survival instincts Priscilla had forged in the fire of Graceland. The fortune was a cushion that suffocated her. The final act of this generational trauma played out in the 2020s, and it was brutal. First, the suicide of Benjamin Keogh, Lisa Marie's son, in 2020. He was the spitting image of Elvis. The pressure of that resemblance, the weight of the expectation, broke him. He put a shotgun in his mouth at the age of 27. The grandson of the king chose to leave the building permanently. Then, on January 12, 2023, Lisa Marie Presley collapsed from cardiac arrest. She was 54 years old. The autopsy revealed a devastating truth. She died from complications of weight loss surgery, a desperate measure to fit the impossible standards set by her legacy. Opioids were also found in her system, ghosts of the family curse. Whether strictly by the complications of the surgeon's knife or the heavy toll of a lifetime in the spotlight, the outcome was the same. The Presley heart gave out. Priscilla Presley, at 77 years old, had to bury her daughter. She stood by the grave in the meditation garden at Graceland, the same garden she had opened to the public 40 years earlier. She was the last one standing. She had buried the husband who groomed her, the father-in-law who hated her, and now the daughter who was the only tangible proof of their love. But grief in the Presley world is never allowed to be just grief. It is immediately monetized and litigated. Before the dirt had settled on Lisa Marie's grave, the vultures returned. This time, the conflict was internal. Priscilla challenged the validity of her daughter's will, pitting herself against her own granddaughter, Riley Keogh. The public watched in dismay, the grandmother and the granddaughter fighting over the keys to the kingdom. It was ugly. It was tawdry. It was exactly what Elvis would have hated and exactly what he had set in motion. The living doll was now an elderly woman fighting for relevance and control in an empire that was slipping away. The settlement was reached, millions were exchanged, and Priscilla was effectively removed from the trust. She was given a payout and told to step aside. The architect was fired from the building she had saved. Graceland wins. It always does. Tourists still pay to walk those hallways, buying the teddy bears and the myth. They don't see the pills. They don't see the abuse. They see exactly what the estate sells them. Priscilla Presley remains. She is the survivor, the witness, and the final artifact. She walks red carpets, her face still smooth, her hair still perfect, a testament to the discipline Elvis instilled in her 60 years ago. She played the role he assigned her until it wasn't a role anymore. It was her skin. She is the living doll who outlived the toy maker. But as she stands alone in the silence of her own history, one has to wonder if she ever truly escaped the jar, or if she just learned to decorate the glass so well that she forgot she was still inside.